looks like I'm live. Just gonna see if I can hear myself, check the audio, and then we'll get right into it. Guys, this is the second episode of a series on how to go from not a programmer to building a MVP. And this is something that's really exciting to me because it's how I got our company off the ground. All right, so it sounds good. So yeah, co-founder of Dubsado, we started about 4 years ago. And before that, I had been programming for about 6 years. And on and off in a little bit of community college and a lot of it just being self-taught. So I really want to push the idea of just going through and teaching yourself how to do things over shelling out a bunch of money for a degree. I really think, especially maybe if this isn't the career path you want to go, but you just want to sharpen your skills in a different area, self-taught's a great way to go. We have at least one person on staff here as a developer who is completely self-taught, has no 4-year degree at all. And then almost all the other developers that we have gone through code academies, and which has been a success for us because it brings people up to speed to a sort of a mid to junior level education. But anyway, what I really want to impress is that programming is for everybody, and it can be a lot of fun, but you really have to just spend your time, and you have to find a passion for it, because if you're not going to get passionate for it, if you're not going to do this every day, if this isn't something that you want to do, then it's just going to be a headache, and you're really not going to get anything from it. So that's my little matrix demonstration. I found that on the internet. It's pretty fun. JavaScript is one of the big things that I'll be talking about in this series, because I prefer simplicity over complexity, especially at the beginning. I think JavaScript can be taught from the beginning to the end, and you can become a very successful entrepreneur developer with just JavaScript knowledge. And that's going to go against what you'll hear a lot in the industry, and that is you need to be a genius, you need to have superpowers, and all sorts of different things. But it's just not true, because all that's going to do is make you feel really crappy here while you're learning. And no matter where you are in the spectrum of knowledge and programming, there's always someone else who's going to be better than you. There's always something new that you're going to need to learn. It's really a lifelong thing. And I'm so excited to be doing this course, because I want to break it down, the whole web development process, into the smallest bites, so that you can have a basic understanding as to how things work. Because when I got started in this, I didn't even know what a web server was, and unbeknownst to me, it was basically just a computer that was in some closet inside Network Solutions. But to me, that there was a weird disconnect. I didn't even get it. So what we'll be going over today is just a general web development overview, and we'll be focused on NodeJs, which is JavaScript for the backend, and JavaScript, which we'll be using in the front end later on in the course. There won't be too much code going on today, and we'll be answering some questions like, what is a backend? What is a front end? What is a mobile app? HTML, a little bit of CSS, why these things exist, how they exist, and how they're used to make a web application. So a quick history of JavaScript. I found this great little article, and it'll be posted and linked here in the video notes. And basically, we had network computers, we had a web browser, but everything was just very plain looking. There was no interactivity. We had links, and we had text, and we had images. And so we just like anything in computer science, we've had some key people make some key discoveries or some key products, and I honestly don't remember all of the people's names or anything like that, but it is very interesting to read through. So I guess here in 1993 we have developer Mark and Dreesen, helping the National Center for Supercomputing Applications. I can't imagine what a supercomputer looked like in 1993. We're probably working on the same power. We had Java at the time, and JavaScript has it kind of looks the same, in my opinion, to Java, but the way things function is not really similar at all. JavaScript was invented to run in the browser, whereas you had Java applets and stuff you might be familiar with, which were just kind of like little pieces of code that you could run in, but it turned out to not be a very secure way to run code in the browser. So they wanted something, and they call it a scripting language, which means it kind of just, you just run it. You don't really compile it, which would make things maybe more efficient, but a little bit more complicated to code. How it's designed. I would check out this article. You'll see this term a lot, ECMA script. And we're on, let's see, current JavaScript version. So yeah, you'll see ES6, ES8, ES 2017. Basically, as web browsers continue to converge on what JavaScript should be, you get new features introduced, and that's the big difference between each one is a different feature that's been added into the feature set and into what the browser can perform for you. And who uses JavaScript? Pretty much everyone. Anything that's in the web right now is running JavaScript. I mean, it's used by the Google Analytics if they have trackers on the page to send cookies in the right places and make web requests and all sorts of things. My point here, it's not perfect, but it gets the job done, is important because a lot of people don't like JavaScript. They don't like working in it for a variety of reasons. And some of them were highlighted in that article. But for all intents and purposes, it gets the job done. And for any of the shortcomings, there are ways that you can get around it. And it's at this point, I don't think it's worth getting into why it sucks and how it could be better, because there's other people that are at that stage and they're working on improving that already. This will be a super basic overview of programming and web development. And there is no perfect way to become a developer. There's no one easy solution that will turn you into a magician or wizard of code. But the only way through, and there is only one way, and that is absolute persistence and dedication. And that normally comes after your first maybe week, maybe month of when you're like realizing that this is such a powerful tool, like programming in general, that you literally just want to do it all the time. And the process of problem solving becomes something that you're passionate for, and you're for some reason spending your Saturday afternoons programming strange algorithms and doing math problems again, and it really just re-energizes you in the whole realm of educating yourself and doing something. I mentioned earlier that I'm the co-founder of Dubsado. I had bootstrapped the core application on my own. It took about 6 months to get our MVP up and running, and then after that, we spent about a year marketing it, and we ended up having enough to build a little team in house, and we have 8 developers in house now, and that's freed up my time a little bit, where I would like to give back. I would like to build a community around programming and meet some new people and just really get out there. So that's why I'm here. I think that knowledge in this field will help anybody of any age, and if I can help one person through this process, then I'm very excited. Node.js is a branch of programming that lets you write JavaScript on the back end, which is like a web server or something like that, and we'll get into that a little bit more in depth. JavaScript is good because there's a lot of community support. There's a large amount of people on the internet and forums and Stack Overflow and stuff like that are communicating with each other daily. They're making different modules that let you kind of plug into your application to make certain aspects of it a little bit easier or a little bit quicker. A lot of the problems that you run into, if you search having blah 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 problem, it's gonna pop up with probably a solid solution via Stack Overflow. Sometimes when there is too much support or the support maybe isn't as high quality, you're gonna come across some bad solutions for something, and when you're learning in the beginning, you might not be able to tell the difference between something that looks good on code but in effect has like severe detrimental effects or infects your computer with a virus or something like that. So I do think it is important to be connected with people like myself or someone who's willing to mentor you and to answer your questions in a reasonable way that can help guide you along the right path. Because if you're just going to get into programming so you can go on the internet and find the solutions for everything that you're going to do, it's really not as fun, it's not as rewarding, and quite often, more than not, you're going to have problems that you're running into that aren't going to be able to be found on the internet. It's just the nature of it, and the nature of programming is solving problems that you created for yourself, and not everyone is going to be solved through the internet. So what is the back end? What is the front end? I have this quick and dirty diagram. And here, this cloud is the internet, which goes from your router to your ISP, which goes to DNS, and a bunch of stuff happens right here. But let's say we're on Facebook right here in our browser. It hits the internet, and the internet's like, oh, okay, we're trying to go to facebook.com or Facebook/API or something like that. And they hit Facebook's web server. This becomes the backend, which is maybe where we're storing some databases. It's where we're going to be running some code that actually tells this browser what it should be doing. So the web server will send HTML, it'll send CSS, it'll send JavaScript, it'll send JSON, which is a serialized version of information which is easily read via JavaScript, and it'll send cookies. And now for the way back from your browser to the internet / to the server all the way, the primary function is so that we can send information back to the server. So we can say, hey, get me a new page, or we could say, and that would be via a URL or a request saying, give me some more information. We could send information to the server for it to store. And along with all of these requests, we're going to be sending cookies. And those cookies help this browser identify itself from the other millions of browsers that are accessing the same server. So the front end distinguishes itself from the back end because the front end is all stuff that your computer is going to be running or your user's computer is going to be running. Your back end is something that's going to be hosted by you. Normally, and most likely at this day and age, you're going to be hosting that with AWS, you're going to be hosting that with Google Cloud Provider, or one of my favorite hosting providers has been DigitalOcean. And let's see. So one thing about what happens in the back end is there's a bunch of different languages. There's Go, there's Rust, C++, you could write a server, and PHP, Java, NodeJS. There's a bunch of different ways that we can write code here, and they're all going to have disadvantages. They're all going to have advantages. It's basically all about picking which one's going to work for you. And I've chosen Node.js because I'm not a genius. I'm not going to learn 30 different languages. I'm not going to
know everything about everything. I've decided that I'm going to focus on this aspect. I'm going to know everything that I can about it. But essentially, at this point, I think an important part to know is how computers talk to each other on what are called sockets. And so we expose different ports. And primarily the browser views everything on port 80 if it's not secure, or 443 if it is secure. I think I might have put that in the wrong place. So it just by default knows to hit 443. You see it went away, and now it's reloading. So this web server has to have at least one thing sitting in front of it that accepts on 443. And normally that's going to be known as like Nginx. Oh, I'm drawing a blank. Where it's basically just routing information, and it's not really crunching a lot of work. So you can route things a lot quicker than you can actually do the work behind it. And then below that, you're going to have a server, which is actually crunching the work, which is sending things to databases. Front ends. Technically, the code that your clients run in the browser is sent from the backend. So the backend will send the HTML to your browser, and it shows, and the browser renders it, but your backend is what creates the code. So even though it's running in the browser, you still need to send it from your backend. You can't. There's just no way to magically have your browser have information in it. Like, there has to be some point where you're sending it information. And now, if your web server is only sending HTML and CSS, and it's not really running any code in the browser, that is
Alert from calendar.
Oh my. We have, like, maybe an older way of making web pages was just, it's called static, and it renders a page, it sends form inputs, and you can interact with it. So when you sent your form input back down this path, the web server would be like, okay, I've taken that information, now here, go to this page, this is what it looks like, and then you re-render in the browser. But the new way, which is called a single page application, is running the JavaScript side of things. And the JavaScript says, oh, hey, I've got this information that I want to send to the database. Let me just send this JSON data request down to the internet through your web server, and just send back any relevant information. So this browser stops refreshing. It's a lot more efficient. It's a lot more complicated, to be honest. But it's the de facto way to basically make any application now. But if we backtrack a little bit to Ruby on Rails, this was one of the... Let's see. Let's try Wikipedia. But this is one of the driving forces between the old way of making websites, which was very... It's just kind of scrappy, and let's just slap a bunch of things together. This says, okay, you tell me what you want this site to look like and kind of declare it, and we'll make up a bunch of code, and then it's just going to work. It just kind of cooks. It cooks a website for you based on the schema that you give it, and that's a really handy way to get up and running really quickly. But one thing, if you want to get up and running quickly, is that later down the line, it's not going to be as easily scalable and so forth. So I don't have a whole lot of solutions for maybe a more advanced version of getting up quickly with a single page application and something like Rails. I mean, you can make a RESTful API, which is great, but still, I wouldn't suggest something like this. I really want to stay in Node.js. I really want to have a finite control over the things that we're making. But if you do want to experiment with this a little bit, I would suggest it. One that I got started with early on is called Cake PHP, and something like this. So let's see. Just real quick. Basically, just have MySQL as a database on your server. Have it running. We went over commands in the last video, so we can see this PHP command. It should be installed in a lot of distributions of Mac and of Windows. You can see they have a -v right there. So that's going to search for the version. So we can see that my computer came with PHP 7.3.9, which is one of the more modern ones, and they say they're looking for at least 7.2. Okay, so there's a bunch of installation steps. It's beyond the scope of this tutorial, but I wanted to see that. I don't know where the tutorial is. Tutorial. There it is. I would suggest, no matter what you do, like Cake PHP I said was one of my first major applications that I made, and I started with the tutorials, and even after I'd finished a tutorial once, I would just go back, delete it, and just do the whole thing over again so I could remember it. Because when you're calling functions, when you're doing things in the code, you really want to have an understanding of the difference between, is this a PHP thing, is this a Cake PHP thing? You want to look into the documentation, but you also want to follow the guideline of the tutorial, because they're going to give you kind of the style for what your code should look like underneath this framework. Moving on, away from Rails, away from Cake PHP. Those are just quick ways to make applications quickly, but they're not necessarily the single page applications. A single page application, for example, is going to be your AngularJS and your React.js, which are the two popular frameworks right now. And what I mean by framework, it's basically not introducing any new language into your scope of what you're working with, but it is changing how you create things. It is changing the way things are laid out, and it is changing a lot of things. So a framework is kind of just a way of doing things. And it also comes with different libraries and different ideas under the hood. So that brings me to a mobile app. And I wanted to bring that up at this point because a lot of new developers have the idea of creating an iPhone app or an Android app. And so they Google, how do I make an iPhone app? And you're going to see a lot of things specific to each phone. In iOS, you're going to be seeing this language called Swift or Objective-C. In Android, you're going to be running Java. And these are performance benefits to run the actual language of the phone, because that's what they're meant to run. That's what's going to run best in them. But what we have in the modern times now is this thing called React Native, and it lets you code JavaScript, which ultimately ends up being some form of the Java for Android or Swift Objective-C for iOS. So you have one-ish code base, depending on how everything works out or what specific phone components you want to use. You might break it up, but you'll be able to share code and stuff like that, or at least have everything in JavaScript. My point is, I think the future is going to a place where, especially if you're only making an application, let's say like it's a fitness app or it's a social media app, and you're not necessarily doing a lot of crazy things with the gyroscope or I don't even know, like the cameras. I mean, it all has access through React Native. I'm trying to think of what the benefits are, even going back to just making a native app, because really it's hard to tell the difference at this point when you're using a native app or if you're using a React Native app. And so by going through a web design course, you're really gonna learn yourself in JavaScript, and you're gonna be able to learn how to make apps eventually. The main point is that you need to learn the skills of problem solving. You need to find your way around certain core components of programming in the first place before even considering making an app. And so a lot of people want to make games too, and that's another big thing is these concepts, even though we're going to be focused on web design, if you're coding in a game, it's going to be similar to coding anywhere else. You have to understand scopes and inheritance and all the different concepts of programming. And if you want to make games, you're basically going to get into Unity, or you're going to get into the Unreal Engine or something like that. And that ultimately becomes how much time you're willing to spend inside those GUIs. And ultimately, you're going to be spending a lot of time doing that. But learning programming is ultimately all going to be the same thing. And web development really gives you a core mentality for how programs should be laid out. It's not going to be as intense if you were a video game developer and wanted to work on the core engine. That's going to be more finite. You're going to be working in lower level languages. You're going to be more high performant. Web development, especially if you're making an MVP, you don't really need to worry too much about how quick things are, maybe by the millisecond. If it's 50 milliseconds, if it's 100 milliseconds, fine. It's not a big deal. Garbage collection is something that happens inside of the lower level languages, which happens magically in JavaScript for you. So that's something that you don't have to worry about. And we're not going to talk about. We don't have to worry about it because it just happens. But it is something I suggest looking up. If you hear some terms that you don't know, and I don't go into enough depth about it, please do make note to look into it. We'll talk briefly about how the backend sends HTML back to the browser. Basically, it's called a markup language. And it lets you put blocks of code that look like this, and then it lets you wrap other blocks of code on the inside. And then inside here, you can add little attributes to it. And this is important because I think since the internet was invented, this looks almost exactly the same. We've added a couple features, but other than that, HTML is HTML. And we've just added a layer of styles on top of it, and we've added a layer of interaction via JavaScript. I put space, doesn't matter. So like, if you put a bunch of spaces in here, it doesn't matter because the browser comes through and it's like, oh, okay, HTML, got it. Now we have a body. Okay, so now the parser is going through and it's looking for a closing body. Got it. Okay, so now that it has open body and a closed body, it can style it the way it's going to style. And now that it's already got this HTML here, it knows to look for the last HTML. So this is a super basic example. This example wouldn't actually look like anything if you rendered it to the browser. It would just say hello world. What is CSS? So basically, if we wanted to go back to this hello world and give it some styling, we could add it in here. Make this purple. Anything in between these quotes is going to be styled with CSS. Originally, without CSS, this would have looked something like color equals and then hex code. Just make it black. But that's the old way of doing it. Now we have what this is called inline styles, but then the HTML can also include a file on the outside, which would just be plain old CSS. And it lets you target different elements. So let's say this is another element or attribute called class. And this class is hello world. And then we would target that HTML via its name. So, for example, if we wanted to give it some styles in CSS, it would look, minus the brackets, but and we'll get into all this later. But this portion right here, minus the bullets, would say, hello world, the color should be purple. So we could get rid of this style. And what that lets us do is separate our HTML out from what it's actually going to look like. And why that is important is you want to separate things out as much as you can so that things are maintainable, especially if you had more than one of these hello world. You want them all to be purple. You wouldn't want to style them all individually. You'd want to use a class. So that's a super basic, high-level understanding of the internet, web development, Node.js, JavaScript, and so forth. I hope you found some value in just getting a high-level understanding of this stuff. And in the next sections, we'll be getting into a little bit more advanced studies as to what we'll be actually making in the course of this program. I thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.